Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the beginning of the African slave trade. In the second episode, we talked about a 1441 Portuguese voyage to Africa, which returned with 24 captives. And in this episode, we will talk about the consequences of that voyage. After the 1441 voyage to Africa, the Portuguese explorers returned to the court of Prince Henry the Navigator with 24 captives. Among them was a nobleman named ADAHU who spoke Arabic, which many Portuguese nobles also spoke. Prince Henry himself ordered ADAHU a fine set of clothes while he negotiated a bargain with his captors. He would be returned to his homeland in exchange for 10 African slaves to take his place. ADAHU also taught the Portuguese about the African slave trade already in place. Tuaregs and Berbers carried out raids against sub-Saharan Africans to the south, selling them to Moroccan merchants on the coast for grain and other agricultural products. In 1442, Antão Gonçalves returned with ADAHU to Cabo Branco and its now famous galley-shaped rock promontory. The finely dressed ADAHU was allowed to vanish into the thicket while the Portuguese waited for him. A week later, a Moroccan merchant arrived riding a white camel joined by a translator called an alfaqueque. They brought a group of 100 slaves and gave the Portuguese permission to choose 10. The alfaqueque also threw in an ox-hide shield, a small sack of gold dust, and 3 ostrich eggs. Gonçalves left, having given the river its Portuguese name, Rio de Ouro. Prince Henry himself ate the ostrich eggs and declared them as fresh as hen's eggs, despite their being in the hold of a ship for weeks before they arrived at his table. Prince Henry took a keen interest in the slave trade, insisting that anyone taken from Africa was being saved from paganism and cannibalism, though he never asked any African their opinion on the matter. In 1444, Portuguese merchants who had previously been skeptical about Prince Henry's African adventures formed a company chartered to trade with Africa. Captain Loncarat de Freitas sailed south and picked up 235 slaves taken in raids by the Azanagi nation, which practiced a harsh version of Islam and already raided their southern neighbors to sell to North African merchants based in Morocco. De Freitas arrived home on August 11, 1444, where Prince Henry greeted him and took 1/5 of the captives as his royal due. He distributed them to members of his entourage. ZURARA, Prince Henry's usually fawning biographer, wrote movingly of the suffering of the African slaves in Portugal. He wrote, "What heart could be so hard as to not be pierced with feeling to see that company? For some kept their heads low and their faces bathed in tears, looking upon one another. Others stood groaning, carrying out loudly, as if asking for help from the Father of nature. Others struck their faces with the palms of their hands, while others made lamentations in the manner of dirge. Then it was needful to part fathers from sons, husbands from wives, and brothers from brothers. If the Lagos merchants were troubled by the horrible trade they entered into, the money made quieted their consciences. These African voyages made as much as a 50% profit, a staggering return at the time. The next year, the Lagos merchant sent another voyage to the Senegal River, believed to be the western end of Egypt's Nile River. The expedition included 23 caravels commanded by Álvaro Fernandes, son-in-law of Zarco, the explorer who found Madeira Island a generation earlier. In the summer of 1445, he landed at what he called the Cape of Masts, a beach lined with palm trees which had their tops blown off by strong winds only days before his arrival. There, Fernandes found piles of elephant dung as high as a man's head. He pushed further south and reached the Gambia River, now 500 miles south of Cabo Branco. The Portuguese found a tropical savanna covered with cultivated fields, and the local people offered them elephant meat to eat. The Portuguese also found ivory and acacia gum to trade, assuring that more Portuguese would come in their wake. Finally, they found a Portuguese mariner named João Fernandes who had lived in Africa for 3 years after leaving one of the voyages and had learned much about Africa that he would soon share with his countrymen. That wraps things up for this episode of the Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.